The Trap Springs Commander Vex of the Krell Dominion stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Blood Talon, watching the view screen with predatory satisfaction. His scaled fingers drummed against the armrest of his command throne, creating a rhythmic clicking sound that echoed through the silent bridge. The Krell had ruled the Outer Rim territories for nearly 2 centuries, their reputation built on the wreckage of 1,000 conquered vessels and the fear of 10,000 more. No ship that entered the Nebula Corridor left without paying tribute, and those foolish enough to resist became object lessons scattered among the asteroids. The censor officer, a young Krell warrior named Thax, turned from his console with barely contained excitement. His yellow eyes gleamed in the dim red lighting of the bridge as he announced the discovery that would change everything. A single human cargo vessel had been detected moving through their territory, its transponder identifying it as the Horizon's Promise, registered out of Earth's commercial shipping lanes. The ship appeared to be hauling standard freight containers, the kind that typically carried mining equipment, food supplies, or civilian goods between the outer colonies and the core worlds. According to their intelligence network, human cargo ships were notoriously underdefended, relying on speed and diplomatic immunity rather than weapons. It was the perfect target, a fat prize waiting to be plucked. Commander Vex allowed himself a thin smile, revealing rows of serrated teeth that had torn through the throats of numerous enemies in personal combat. He had been hunting in these sectors for 15 years, rising through the ranks of the Krell raiding fleet by being more ruthless and more cunning than his rivals. His record was flawless. Never once had a target escaped his grasp, and never once had he suffered significant losses to his fleet. The humans were newcomers to this region of space, their expansion into the Outer Rim only beginning in the last decade. They had no understanding of the rules that govern survival in the lawless territories beyond the Federation's protection. They would learn today, as so many others had learned before them. The Blood Talon was not alone in the darkness. 5 other Krell warships hung in the void around them, their hulls invisible against the cosmic background, cloaked by advanced stealth technology that the Krell had stolen from a now extinct species called the Valeri. Each ship was a masterpiece of predatory design, bristling with plasma cannons, missile pods, and boarding equipment. The fleet represented the combined strength of Vex's entire raiding clan, more than enough firepower to overwhelm a merchant vessel 100 times over. This would be quick, efficient, and profitable. The cargo would be seized, the crew would be sold to the slave markets of the Draxan Confederacy, and the ship itself would be stripped for parts. Just another day in the Nebula Corridor, just another victim added to the long list. Vex gave the order to begin the attack sequence, and his crew moved with practiced precision. The 6 Krell ships adjusted their positions, forming a perfect spherical net around the approaching human vessel. They would decloak simultaneously, appearing from nowhere to surround their prey before it could react. The tactic had never failed. The shock and terror of sudden encirclement broke the will of most crews immediately, and those who tried to fight found themselves caught in crossfire from every direction. The censor officer confirmed that the human ship showed no sign of detecting their presence. Its course remained steady, its speed unchanged, its weapon systems cold and inactive. They suspected nothing. The moment arrived with the precision of a choreographed dance. 6 Krell warships shimmered into existence, their cloaking fields dropping away to reveal hulls painted in the blood red and black colors of Vex's clan. The human cargo ship suddenly found itself trapped in a cage of hostile vessels, each one bristling with enough weapons to reduce it to atoms. Vex opened a communication channel, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority and the promise of violence. He delivered the standard ultimatum that had preceded 1,000 successful raids. The human vessel would power down its engines immediately, transfer control of its navigation systems to the Blood Talon, and prepare to be boarded. Resistance would result in the destruction of the ship and the execution of the entire crew. Compliance would result in imprisonment and eventual sale, but at least they would live. He gave them 60 seconds to respond. The bridge of the Horizon's Promise could not have presented a starker contrast to the predatory atmosphere of the Krell flagship. Captain Elena Torres sat calmly in her command chair, a cup of coffee resting in the holder beside her, steam rising lazily in the recycled air. She was a woman in her early 40s, with short dark hair streaked with gray and eyes that held the kind of steady confidence that came from 20 years of military service before her transition to civilian shipping. Around her, the crew moved with quiet efficiency, their faces showing no trace of panic or fear despite the 6 warships that had just materialized around them. The tactical officer, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, glanced at Torres with a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The engineering chief, Sarah Chen, actually laughed softly as she monitored her console, shaking her head at the Krell's predictable behavior. Torres let the full 60 seconds tick down before she responded, taking a leisurely sip of her coffee and setting the cup down with deliberate care. When she finally opened the communication channel, her voice was almost friendly, carrying none of the terror or desperation that Vex had expected to hear. She thanked the Krell commander for his generous offer, but politely declined to surrender. The Horizon's promise would be continuing on its scheduled route, and she suggested that the Krell ships move out of the way before there was an unfortunate accident. Her tone was the same one might use when declining an invitation to dinner, casual and completely unafraid. On the Blood Talon's bridge, several Krell officers exchanged confused glances, uncertain whether the human captain was insane, stupid, or simply didn't understand the situation. Commander Vex felt his predatory satisfaction curdle into irritation. Defiance was not uncommon among the more foolish prey species, but this human's complete lack of fear was something new and unsettling. He decided to make an example that would clarify their situation beyond any doubt. He ordered his weapons officer to fire a precision strike against the human ship's cargo section, a demonstration shot that would tear through their hull plating and expose the vulnerable interior to the vacuum of space. The plasma cannon charged with a rising whine, its capacitors building up enough energy to punch through meters of reinforced metal. The shot lanced across the void, a stream of superheated matter traveling at a fraction of light speed. It struck the Horizon's promise exactly where intended, and for a moment, Vex allowed himself to feel satisfaction at the sight of the explosion that blossomed against the cargo ship's hull. But then something impossible happened, something that would haunt Vex's nightmares for the brief remainder of his life. The cargo containers attached to the Horizon's promise began to detach, separating from the main hull with mechanical precision. As they drifted away from the ship, their outer shells split open like flowers blooming in fast motion, revealing what had been hidden inside. These were not cargo containers filled with mining equipment or civilian supplies. These were weapons platforms, each one bristling with missile launchers, railgun batteries, and point defense systems. The Horizon's promise had not been a helpless cargo vessel blundering into Krell territory. It had been bait, a carefully constructed lure designed to draw predators into striking range. The human ship's hull plating suddenly retracted in sections, revealing additional weapon emplacements that had been concealed beneath false panels. Sensor arrays that had appeared damaged or inactive blazed to life, painting every Krell vessel with active targeting locks. The Horizon's promise transformed before their eyes from prey into predator, its true nature revealed in the span of seconds. Captain Torres's voice came across the communication channel again, but this time there was no friendly casualness in her tone. She spoke with the cold authority of someone who held all the cards and knew it. She informed Commander Vex that he and his fleet had just fallen into a carefully prepared trap, one that had been specifically designed to deal with Krell raiders operating in this sector. The humans had grown tired of losing ships to piracy, and they had decided to solve the problem permanently. The weapon platforms opened fire first, their missiles streaking toward the Krell ships in swarms that overwhelmed targeting computers designed for ship-to-ship combat. The railguns followed, accelerating tungsten penetrators to velocities that made armor plating irrelevant. The Krell warship Shadowfang, positioned at the lower vertex of their formation, took the first devastating hit. A railgun slug punched through its primary reactor shielding, and the ship simply ceased to exist in a flash of light brighter than a small sun. The shockwave from the explosion buffeted the nearby vessels, their shields flaring as they struggled to dissipate the energy. On the Blood Talon's bridge, alarms began screaming in a dozen different frequencies, each one announcing a new threat or a new failure in their tactical situation. Commander Vex's mind raced through options with the speed of desperation, but every scenario ended in disaster. They were too close to use their heavy weapons without risking damage from the explosions. The human platforms had positioned themselves perfectly to create intersecting fields of fire, and their own formation had become a trap that prevented maneuvering. He ordered an immediate counterattack. All ships were to focus fire on the Horizon's promise itself, Perhaps if they could destroy the central vessel, the automated platforms would lose coordination. The Krell warships opened up with everything they had, plasma bolts and missiles converging on the human ship from multiple angles. But the Horizon's promise was moving now, its engines burning at full power as it executed evasive maneuvers that should have been impossible for a vessel of its size. The human ship's point defense systems created a wall of intercepting fire that swatted missiles from space like insects, while its shield generators, far more powerful than anything a cargo vessel should possess, absorbed the plasma fire with barely a flicker. Another Krell ship, the Bone Crusher, exploded as a concentrated barrage from 3 weapon platforms overwhelmed its defenses. Thax, the sensor officer, shouted a warning that made Vex's blood run cold. New contacts were appearing on their sensors, ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel at coordinates that should have been impossible to calculate with such precision. 3 human military cruisers materialized from jump points that had been hidden in the nebula's interference, their weapons already hot and ready to fire. The trap had been even more elaborate than Vex had realized in his worst fears. The Horizon's promise had not just been bait, it had been the lure that drew them into a killing box where human warships waited in ambush. Captain Torres had not been alone and vulnerable. She had been the centerpiece of a coordinated military operation designed to eliminate the Krell threat once and for all. The 3 cruisers were massive compared to the raiding ships, each one carrying more firepower than Vex's entire fleet combined. Their hulls were painted in the dark gray of Earth's defense navy, and their identification transponders broadcast names that seemed chosen specifically to send a message. The lead cruiser was the Retribution, flanked by the Vengeance and the Reckoning. Vex made the only decision left to him, the decision that went against every instinct of a predator, but was the only path to survival. He opened a general fleet channel and gave the order that no Krell commander wanted to give, the order to retreat at maximum speed and scatter in all directions. Perhaps some of his ships would escape if they broke formation and ran. Perhaps the humans would not pursue them all. But even as he gave the order, he knew it was futile. The human cruisers had positioned themselves to block every escape route. Their faster engines and superior sensors would track any Krell ship that tried to flee. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey had revealed itself to be something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Captain Torres watched the Krell fleet's desperate attempt to escape with cold satisfaction. She had spent 6 months planning this operation, studying Krell tactics, analyzing their previous raids, and predicting exactly how they would respond to what appeared to be an easy target. Every detail had been calculated, from the timing of the Horizon's promises passage through the corridor, to the placement of the weapon platforms, to the jump coordinates for the cruisers. The Krell had been predictable because they had grown arrogant, comfortable in their dominance of the outer rim, and unprepared for an enemy that could match their cunning and exceed their firepower. She gave the order for her fleet to close the trap completely, and the human warships moved forward like the jaws of some immense predator, closing around struggling prey. The Krell warship Reaver's Claw attempted to break through the human formation, its captain gambling everything on a desperate charge toward the smallest gap in the encirclement. It made it almost 3 kilometers before the Retribution's main batteries spoke. Heavy particle beams that reduced the Krell ship to expanding clouds of vapor and debris. Another vessel, the Night Stalker, tried to use the nebula's interference to mask its retreat. But the human sensors could see through the cosmic fog with clarity that Krell technology could not match. The Vengeance dispatched it with a spread of antimatter missiles that left nothing behind but radiation. One by one, the ships that had terrorized this sector for years were being systematically destroyed, their reign of terror ending in fire and violence. On the Blood Talon, Commander Vex watched his fleet die around him and felt something he had not experienced in 15 years of raiding. Genuine fear for his own survival. 2 of his ships were gone, vaporized completely, and a third was tumbling out of control with its engines destroyed and its hull breached in a dozen places. The humans were not just defeating them, they were obliterating them with a precision and efficiency that spoke of absolute tactical superiority. This was not a desperate defense by frightened merchants. This was a military execution carried out by professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. Vex realized with terrible clarity that humanity was not the weak newcomer species he had believed them to be. They were something far more dangerous, and he had made the fatal mistake of underestimating them. The communication channel crackled to life again, and Captain Torres's voice filled the Krell bridge with words that carried the weight of judgment. She informed Vex that his fleet had two options remaining, both of them ending with the destruction of his ships, but one of them offering the possibility of survival for his crews. He could order his remaining vessels to power down all weapons and prepare to be boarded, in which case the humans would take them prisoner and they would stand trial for piracy and murder. Or he could continue fighting, in which case they would all die in the next few minutes. She gave him 30 seconds to decide, and the timer on his console began counting down with merciless precision. Human fury. Unleashed Commander Vex stared at the countdown timer on his console, watching the seconds drain away like the last moments of his life. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to die with honor rather than submit to these upstart humans who had dared to challenge Krell dominance. His clawed hand hovered over the weapons control, ready to give the order that would send his remaining ships into a final suicidal charge. But then he looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew, warriors who had followed him for years, who trusted him to lead them to victory and plunder. They were young, most of them, with decades of life ahead if only he could swallow his pride and accept the reality of their situation. The Krell had always valued strength above all else, but there was a difference between strength and stupidity. With 5 seconds remaining on the timer, Vex made his choice. The communication that went out to his remaining 3 ships carried more bitterness than any words Vex had ever spoken. He ordered all vessels to power down their weapon systems, lower their shields, and prepare for boarding. The acknowledgments came back reluctantly, each captain understanding what this meant for their reputation and their future. In Krell society, surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Warriors who submitted to enemies were stripped of their rank and status, marked as cowards for the rest of their lives. But death held no honor either, not when it was pointless and avoidable. The Blood Talon's weapons went silent. Its shields flickered and died, and the once mighty flagship hung in space like a defeated animal waiting for the predator's final bite. Captain Torres allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction before shifting into the next phase of the operation. She had not come here simply to destroy the Krell raiders, though that would have been justification enough given the hundreds of human lives they had taken over the years. The real objective was more complex and far-reaching. The Outer Rim territories were essential to human expansion, rich in resources and strategically positioned along the trade routes that connected the newer colonies to Earth. But as long as pirate clans like Vex's operated with impunity, those routes would remain dangerous and unreliable. The only way to secure lasting peace was to send a message so clear and so terrifying that every would-be raider in 3 sectors would think twice before attacking a human ship. She opened a channel to the Retribution and gave orders to Captain James Morrison, the commander of the cruiser squadron that had been waiting in ambush. Morrison was a veteran of the border wars, a hard man with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too much death to be moved by mercy. He acknowledged Torres's orders with characteristic brevity and began coordinating the boarding operations. The 3 human cruisers moved into position around the disabled Krell ships, their hangar bays opening to disgorge assault shuttles filled with Marines in full combat armor. These were not the standard security personnel found on civilian vessels. These were professional soldiers trained for ship-to-ship combat in hostile environments, equipped with weapons designed specifically for close-quarters battle in zero gravity. The first shuttle to dock with the Blood Talon carried a full platoon of Marines led by Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone, a woman whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was legendary throughout the Defense Navy. She had led boarding actions against rebel strongholds, pirate bases, and hostile alien vessels, and she had never lost a single Marine under her command. As the shuttle's docking clamps engaged with the Krell airlock, Stone checked her weapon one final time and reviewed the tactical briefing on her helmet display. Intelligence suggested that Krell warriors often chose death over capture, launching desperate attacks even after their ships had surrendered. She had orders to secure the vessel with minimum casualties on both sides, but if the Krell wanted to die fighting, her Marines would happily oblige them. The airlock cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Stone led her team into the Blood Talon's main corridor. The interior of the Krell ship was a study in brutal functionality, all sharp angles and dark metal, with lighting that cast everything in shades of red and shadow. The air carried the acrid scent of ozone and something organic that Stone's implants identified as Krell pheromones, chemical signals that the aliens used to communicate emotional states to their crew. Right now, those pheromones spoke of fear and rage in equal measure, a dangerous combination in a species bred for violence. The Marines advanced in a practiced formation, their weapons sweeping every corner and their sensors painting a real-time tactical map of the ship's interior. They encountered the first Krell warriors at the intersection leading to the ship's armory, where 6 aliens had barricaded themselves behind overturned equipment crates. These were not the disciplined soldiers who had manned their stations during the battle. These were desperate fighters who had chosen death over dishonor. They opened fire with plasma rifles, the superheated bolts searing the air and leaving molten scars on the bulkheads. Stone's Marines returned fire with their railguns, weapons that fired solid projectiles at hypersonic velocities. The Krell's cover evaporated under the assault, the metal crates shredding like paper, and the warriors behind them fell in a matter of seconds. Stone led her team forward without pausing, her voice calm and professional as she reported the engagement to Captain Morrison. Similar scenes played out throughout the captured Krell vessels as human Marines systematically secured each ship section by section. The Krell who chose to resist died quickly, their individual courage no match for the coordinated tactics and superior firepower of professional soldiers who trained for exactly this kind of operation. But most of the Krell crew, faced with the reality of heavily armed humans moving through their ship like an unstoppable force, chose survival over glory. They laid down their weapons and submitted to capture, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred as they were secured with restraints and led to designated holding areas. Within 2 hours of the first boarding, all 3 Krell ships were under complete human control. Commander Vex found himself kneeling on the deck of his own bridge, his hands bound behind his back with restraints that would electrocute him if he attempted to break free. Around him, his senior officers were similarly restrained, forced to watch as human Marines went through the ship's computer systems with practiced efficiency. They were downloading everything: navigational logs, communication records, intelligence databases, financial transactions. Every piece of data that could reveal other Krell operations or identify other pirate clans in the region was being copied and analyzed. Vex understood with growing horror that this had never been just about stopping his fleet. The humans were using him to map out the entire criminal network that operated in the Outer Rim. Lieutenant Commander Stone stood before Vex. Her helmet retracted to reveal a face that showed no emotion whatsoever. She informed him in precise clinical terms that he and his crew would be transported to a human detention facility where they would await trial for piracy, murder, kidnapping, and various other crimes against humanity and allied species. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Their own ship's logs documented years of raids and atrocities. Some of them would likely face execution. Others would spend the rest of their lives in prison. But before any of that happened, Vex would have the opportunity to cooperate with human intelligence services. If he provided information about other pirate operations, if he helped the humans dismantle the criminal networks that plagued this region, his sentence might be reduced. Stone delivered this offer, with the same flat effect she might use to read a maintenance report. Vex looked up at her, with eyes that burned with impotent rage, and asked the question that had been eating at him since the trap was sprung. How had the humans known where his fleet would be? How had they predicted his tactics so perfectly? How had they laid such an elaborate ambush without any indication that they were even aware of his operations? Stone smiled then, a cold expression that held no warmth or humor. She explained that humanity had been watching the Krell raiders for months, tracking their movements through a network of stealth satellites and intelligence assets that Vex had never suspected existed. They had analyzed every raid, every attack, every victim, building a comprehensive profile of Krell operational patterns and tactical preferences. The Horizon's promise had been designed specifically to appeal to Vex's selection criteria, a seemingly vulnerable cargo ship carrying valuable goods through poorly defended space at a predictable time. Everything about the setup had been calculated to trigger the Krell commander's predatory instincts, to make him confident that this would be an easy score. The humans had even fed false intelligence into the information networks that Vex used, ensuring that he would have reports describing the Horizon's promise as a soft target with minimal defenses. From the moment Vex decided to attack that ship, his fate was sealed. He had not been hunting prey. He had been dancing on strings. Controlled by human intelligence officers who understood his psychology better than he understood it himself, Stone turned away from Vex and activated her communication link to Captain Torres, reporting that all 3 Krell vessels were secured and ready for the next phase of operations. Torres acknowledged the report and gave the order that would transform this tactical victory into a strategic message heard across the entire sector. The Krell ships would not be towed away to some secret location. They would not be salvaged for their technology or sold for scrap. Instead, they would remain exactly where they were, dead in space at the location where they had sprung their ambush, transformed into a permanent monument to the consequences of attacking human vessels. The Marines evacuated from the captured ships, taking their Krell prisoners with them in secured transport shuttles. Once the human forces were clear, remote charges that had been planted throughout the Krell vessels detonated in a carefully choreographed sequence. The explosions were not designed to completely destroy the ships. Instead, they crippled specific systems, rendering the vessels non-functional but leaving their hulls largely intact. The Blood Talon, Shadow's Edge, and Crimson Reaver would drift through the nebula corridor indefinitely, their emergency beacons broadcasting a recorded message on all frequencies. The message was simple and direct, delivered in 17 different languages spoken by the various species that traveled these trade routes. Captain Torres had recorded the message herself, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. She stated that these vessels represented the remains of a Krell pirate fleet that had attacked a human ship, expecting an easy victory. Instead, they had encountered a prepared and determined enemy that had destroyed half their fleet and captured the rest. The Krell crews were now in human custody, facing justice for their crimes. Any other pirates, raiders, or hostile forces that considered attacking human vessels should look upon these wrecked ships and understand that humanity would respond to aggression with overwhelming force. The Outer Rim territories were under human protection now, and that protection would be enforced with extreme prejudice against anyone foolish enough to test it. The message played on an endless loop, and the wrecked Krell ships became a landmark known throughout the sector. Other species traveling through the nebula corridor would drop out of faster-than-light travel, specifically to see the monument, to verify that the stories were true. Merchant captains from a dozen different civilizations would point out their viewports at the drifting wrecks and tell their crews about the day humanity announced its presence. In the Outer Rim with fire and fury, young warriors from aggressive species would study the tactical recordings of the battle, analyzing how the Krell fleet had been lured, trapped, and destroyed with such clinical efficiency. And pirates considering raids on human shipping would look at those dead vessels and decide that perhaps there were easier targets elsewhere. The impact on pirate activity in the region was immediate and dramatic. Within weeks of the battle, attacks on human vessels dropped by nearly 90%. The few pirates foolish enough to ignore the warning found themselves facing similar traps, as the humans deployed their Q-ship tactics across multiple trade routes. The Horizon's promise was not alone. There were half a dozen other vessels just like it, innocent-looking cargo ships that were actually heavily armed warships waiting for someone to make the mistake of attacking them. The Human Defense Navy had decided that the best way to protect their shipping was not to escort every vessel with warships, but to make every vessel a potential warship. Pirates could never be certain which ships were genuine, merchants and which were predators in disguise. Commander Vex and his surviving crew members were transported to a human detention facility on the colony, world of New Tasmania, where they awaited trial in a high-security prison designed to hold the most dangerous criminals from multiple species. Vex spent his days in a small cell, replaying the battle in his mind, trying to understand how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. He had been at the top of his profession, feared throughout 3 sectors, wealthy beyond measure from years of successful raids. Now he was a prisoner facing a future that held nothing but punishment and regret. He received visits from human intelligence officers who wanted information about other pirate operations, offering reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. Most of the Krell prisoners refused, choosing pride over pragmatism, but a few accepted the deals and provided intelligence that led to further operations against criminal networks. The trial, when it finally happened, was broadcast across the Outer Rim as a demonstration of human justice. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Years of raids documented in the Krell ship's own computer systems, testimony from survivors of previous attacks, financial records showing the profits from selling captured crews into slavery. The Krell defendants had no real defense, the facts were indisputable. The human court found them guilty on all counts and handed down sentences that ranged from life imprisonment to execution for those responsible for the most heinous crimes. Vex himself received a life sentence without possibility of parole, condemned to spend his remaining decades in a human prison, far from his homeworld and his clan. Back on the bridge of the Horizon's Promise, Captain Elena Torres stood with her crew as they prepared to continue their mission. The ship had sustained only minor damage during the battle, mostly cosmetic scarring from the Krell's initial demonstration shot. The weapon platforms had been recovered and reattached to the hull, their false cargo container shells rebuilt to maintain the ship's disguise. Within days, the Horizon's Promise would be back on patrol, cruising through dangerous space routes and waiting for the next pirate foolish enough to take the bait. Torres looked at the tactical display showing the positions of the wrecked Krell vessels and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. They had done more than win a battle. They had changed the strategic balance of power in an entire region of space. Lieutenant Marcus Webb approached Torres with a data pad containing the latest intelligence reports. Pirates across the Outer Rim were responding to the Nebula Corridor incident in various ways. Some were abandoning their operations entirely and seeking legitimate work. Others were moving their activities to regions farther from human space, and a few were forming alliances to pool their resources against the human threat. Webb suggested that the Defense Navy would need to remain vigilant and continue operations like this one to maintain the deterrent effect. Torres agreed, but she also noted that the humans had accomplished something more valuable than just scaring off a few pirates. They had demonstrated to all the species in this region that humanity was not to be trifled with. The other alien civilizations in the Outer Rim had been watching humanity's expansion with a mixture of curiosity and concern, wondering whether these newcomers would prove to be valuable trading partners or dangerous competitors. The destruction of Vex's fleet answered that question in the clearest possible terms. Humans would trade peacefully with those who respected them, but they would respond to aggression with a level of force that few species could match. The carefully planned ambush, the technological superiority displayed in the battle, the ruthless efficiency of the marine boarding operations, all of it sent a message that resonated far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Humanity had arrived in the Outer Rim, and they intended to stay. In the months and years that followed, the Battle of Nebula Corridor, as it came to be known, became a case study taught in military academies across human space. Tactical officers analyzed the operations planning phase, studying how intelligence had been gathered and used to predict enemy behavior. Strategic planners examined the broader implications of Q-ship operations and the use of overwhelming force to establish deterrence. Psychologists discussed the careful manipulation of enemy expectations and the timing of the trap's revelation. The battle demonstrated that humanity's greatest strength was not any single piece of technology or tactical doctrine, but rather the ability to think creatively, plan comprehensively, and execute operations with precision that left nothing to chance. Captain Torres would go on to command other operations, leading her disguised warship on dozens of patrols through hostile space. She would spring her trap 5 more times over the next 3 years, each time destroying or capturing pirate forces that thought they had found easy prey. Her reputation grew until merely the rumor that the Horizon's Promise might be operating in a sector was enough to deter most raiders. Eventually, she would be promoted to admiral and given command of the entire Q-ship program, overseeing a fleet of disguised warships that protected human interests across multiple sectors. But she would always remember that first battle in the Nebula Corridor, the operation that proved humanity's approach to warfare was effective. The wrecked Krell ships continued to drift through the Nebula Corridor, their emergency beacons still broadcasting Captain Torres's warning message. Decades would pass and those vessels would become part of the local mythology, ghost ships that reminded everyone of the price of underestimating humanity. New generations of spacers would tell stories about the battle, embellishing the details until the tale became almost legendary. But the core truth remained unchanged. A group of pirates had ambushed what they thought was a defenseless human cargo ship, expecting easy surrender and profitable plunder. What they got instead was obliteration, swift and total, delivered by humans who had prepared for exactly such an encounter. The lesson spread throughout the galaxy as humanity continued its expansion into new territories. Other species learned that humans were not to be judged by their appearance or their peaceful overtures. Beneath the friendly exterior of human merchants and diplomats lay a capacity for violence and strategic thinking that rivaled any warrior culture in known space. The humans did not seek conflict, but neither did they shy away from it when necessary. They preferred to trade and negotiate, but when pushed, they would push back with overwhelming force and terrifying efficiency. It was a lesson that the Krell had learned too late, and one that countless other potential enemies would learn in the years to come.